Each January, Calvin University brings you a free 15-day lecture series that aims to cultivate deep thought, share rich stories, and provide an opportunity to learn and grow. Over the past 2 years, we've offered a virtual option, and you have loved it. So we thought, do we really have to wait until January? Welcome to the January series in July. I'm Michael Wiltskett, the new director of this series, and I'm excited to learn alongside you. We'll be back to our regular programming in January of 2023, and I'm excited to share the lineup of speakers in a couple of months. I'm thankful for our underwriters whose support over the years allows us to provide this gift to our community. I'm particularly thankful to Baker Bookhouse, the Meyer Foundation, the Doug and Maria DeVos Foundation, and our daily underwriters. We couldn't do this work without your support. Today, we'll hear a conversation with Professor Deb Rienstra on her recent book, Refugia Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth. Professor Reenstra is a professor of English here at Calvin University, where she has taught since 1996, specializing in early British literature and creative writing. She is the author of 4 books on motherhood, spirituality, worship, and eco-theology climate change, as well as numerous academic essays, literary essays, and poems. Her most recent book that she'll talk about today is Refugia Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth, a book that combines theology, nature writing, and biological principles to consider how Christians must adapt our faith and practice for a climate-altered planet. Professor Reenstra is also the host of Refugia Podcast and writes bi-weekly for the Reformed Journal, writing about spirituality, pop culture, the church, the arts, higher ed, and more. Today's conversation will be with her friend and friend of the January series, Professor Karen Sape. Welcome, Deb, to the January series in July.
Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Sape, and Deb, my colleague, I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks, Karen.
Would you start by explaining the concept of a refugium and where it came from?
Well, I first learned about it from the wonderful book by Kathleen Dean Moore called Great Tide Rising. And I read that book in preparation for Kathleen's visit to Calvin in 2019. And in 4 pages in the middle of that book, she describes the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. And after that eruption, which was, of course, devastating and spread this horrible death ash layer for miles around, biologists looked at the mountain and thought, oh man, we're not going to see anything green here for decades. And lo and behold, 25 years later, the mountain had greened up. And so people went to study this and realized that even under that layer of death ash, there were these little tiny shelters. And just little places under a log where the moss survived. And it was out of those tiny, tiny little remaining pockets of life that the mountain greened up again. Well, those are called refugia. And it's a biological concept that's been around. It has been largely associated with paleontology. So it's an explanation for why the Earth, came back after the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. And now, as I learned more about it, I was just so fascinated with this idea. I had this sense that it was a metaphor for something, right? This is how English...
Because you're an English teacher.
Well, yeah, this is how we read things, Biology is great, but how can we use this as a metaphor? So I learned more about it, and I learned there's this whole field called refugial conservation biology. And it's the study of how life survives and comes back after some kind of major disturbance. So the definition of refugia is that these are places that elements of biodiversity retreat to and persist in and come back from in the midst of a disturbance. And it just struck me that this is this wonderful metaphor, and eventually I realized I think it's a metaphor for the church. Why are we not thinking of ourselves as the places where life retreats to and persists in, life in all its senses, right? In a time of disturbance, because if we're not in a time of disturbance now, I don't know what disturbance would look like, right? I mean, it's just layers of crisis. So it just struck me as a kind of powerful and generative metaphor for the church and really for all people of faith.
I'm intrigued by the metaphor because there is, I think, a sense that the church, broad broadly defined, is in a state of crisis, and maybe it always has been in various kinds of crises, but that people often, I think, either go to a place of sort of desperation or despair and sort of give up and think, well, it's over, or they have the energy and the stamina and the strength and the courage to try to create a major upheaval or reformation.
Yeah.
And this feels like a place in between.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of both. I think Refugia, it's such a lovely model because it's both shelter for those times when we feel overwhelmed, set upon, damaged, right? But it's also a place of capacity building and growth. So one of the things I've thought about as I thought about this in terms of how the church responds to crisis, and not just crisis within the church, but all the crises that we're dealing with, and in particular the climate crisis, the kind of underlayer of all the crises we're dealing with right now. When people are fearful, often what happens is, they go hide, right? So we see this in the church, in this kind of retreat or withdrawal. You see it in the history of the church sometimes. And often that withdrawal is just with people like me, There's a kind of holiness litmus test that you have to pass to be in the safe place. Or what we're seeing now, I think, is this reaction to fear, which is a move to dominance, a move to the church of empire. So we're seeing that a lot in the United States, where we're draping Jesus in a flag and giving him guns. And you can see images like this, and it's horribly toxic, but it's a reaction to fear and just the will to power, right?
Sure.
So Refugia is a whole different thing because it's a way of both providing shelter, but also looking to the life, the healthy ecosystem, if you will, that is really the goal. So, at Calvin, we have often talked about shalom, yeah? Shalom is this vision of the whole community of creation, not just human beings or the church, but the whole community of creation. And this is the redemptive purpose of God. So Refugia is not about dominance. It's about pockets where we practice that shalomic vision on a small scale in the hope that it will grow. So Refugia always have permeable boundaries. They're not bunkers. If they didn't have permeable boundaries, what would be the point? The point is to regrow life. So if we think of the church that way, I think it opens us up to a kind of role as healers. We think of ourselves as healers and people who concentrate on practicing health, ecosystem health. And that can be very literally in terms of church property. What can we do on our church property, this public place, that would model and recreate a kind of ecosystem health? How can we contribute to our community in that way? So Plaster Creek Stewards is one of my favorite examples from Calvin. Plaster Creek Stewards is this wonderful group at Calvin who are engaged in healing the watershed, not just Calvin, right? Not just our property, but the whole watershed that's part of our community, and engaging the community in that work. So that to me is just a paradigmatic refugial practice, where you have this kind of relatively small scale, but you're working on health as a model, both for the people sort of in the group, but for the whole community. And that's how Refugia spreads.
That's been such an interesting project too, because it started pretty small, but it has gained traction, and there are plantings all over town or all over the watershed, rain gardens and such. The church that you and I attend has benefited from some projects there and so forth. You talked about the whole of creation being restored, and you write in the book about what if we thought of plants and lakes and rivers and so forth as beings rather than things, and you give an example of Lake Erie getting personhood status legally.
Yeah. Well,
that's temporarily.
It didn't work in the long term yet.
But I think that's really interesting, because that the word creature that we use to refer usually to animals, but it means created being.
Yeah.
And if God created rocks and rivers and lakes and so forth, then why not think of them as beings rather than things?
Yeah.
one of the main reasons I like your book so much is that it doesn't nag me. It invites me in to appreciate nature. The poet in you and the nature lover in you creates these images of the nature around you that I find very, very appealing, makes me want to care for it a little bit. But it's not requiring that I give up my car and my air conditioning and so forth. It's an invitation rather than a demand, I think. Is that a fair way to put it?
I'm glad to hear you say that. First of all, I'd like to point out I am totally capable of nagging. I've raised 3 children. I can do it. It's one of the kind of bottom line principles of, the old style conservation movement and now the kind of climate movement is that people aren't motivated by guilt. I mean, I as a Calvinist, think guilt is a very useful thing and appropriate. People are not motivated by guilt. People are motivated by love. And I think that's true. And I think for me, the reason I spent a lot of time in the book writing about Michigan is not because I think Michigan is the awesomest place ever. I mean, I kind of do, but I recognize it's not really true. Michigan is just one of many amazing places, but it's where I live, it's where I dwell. And so I wanted to model in the book what it meant to, as writers are always telling us, to pay attention to where I live, to learn about it, to dwell in it more deeply, for the purpose of deepening my love for this place, and through that, deepening my motivation to care for it and to care for all places, because every place is created by God, every place has its own beauties. I mean, even if I freak out and think I'm going to die in a desert, that doesn't mean other people don't love it, or that it's valid even if there's no person in it. It's valid as this, valuable and valid as this place that God has created, full of wonders, right? So writers are good at telling people to pay attention and to pointing out wonders. So I tried to do that a little bit with the book. And that's how I've sort of been able to continue on as I've learned about the climate crisis and entered into that place of, oh man, despair, right? I mean, the more you learn about the climate crisis, the more you realize what we're up against and how deadly serious it is, and the powers and principalities that are preventing us from doing the work we need to do. And in those moments, I mean, all of us who are involved in this, religious or not, you have to enter into this, as Aldo Leopold called it, the world of wounds. Problem with an ecological education, Leopold said, is that you live alone in the world of wounds. Fortunately now, you don't have to live alone there. And that has actually been really encouraging too. So as I've studied the climate crisis more and studied eco-theology more, I realized there's a whole community of people out there. You might even call it a refugium of people out there. Wonderful, beautiful people of all faiths and no faith who are working toward this love, this motivation, this love. You mentioned beingness. I have found students love that idea. So I have taught Richard Power's gorgeous novel, The Overstory, which I recommend to everybody on earth. It's just...
I just put it on my reading list when I finish the book.
Yeah, it is just a beautiful novel, just a beautiful work of literary art. But beyond that, it's so persuasive in awakening us to the beingness of other creatures. And I think this is, students, as I say, just respond to this immediately. They love this idea, because I think intuitively we understand that other living things have their own beingness. But theologically, in our church contexts, we've sort of suppressed that, the theology of that, and we've given in, since the Enlightenment, at least in the West, given in to this sense of human beings as the center of redemptive drama, and everything else is a backdrop on the stage, which can be swept away, But that is not really Orthodox theology. And so it's been wonderful for me to study eco-theology and to realize there's this long tradition of recognizing from the scriptures and from theological reflection, once again, the value and validity of all life. And the distinctiveness of human beings, but the way that God loves and has created and loves every living thing, and even the rocks. Some indigenous peoples would designate rocks as living in their own way too, and I suppose you could make that argument even scientifically. Maybe not, well, anyway.
But even the Bible talks about the trees of the fields clapping their hands and the rocks crying out.
Exactly. Yes, so the biblical witness is full, I think, of the acknowledgement that God has a relationship with this creation, apart from human beings, apart from any notion of our salvation of our souls. And, the whole theological tradition, late Augustine, Irenaeus, Calvin and Luther, good old Calvin and Luther. Calvin and Luther had eschatological visions that included all of creation. And I don't know how you can read the Bible, once you've sort of been cued into that, I don't know how you can read the Bible and miss that. The redemptive plan includes all creation. But we have sort of, I think, truncated our theological reflection on that since the Enlightenment. And there's kind of insidious reasons for that, because truncating that acknowledgement of the beingness of other creatures is really the fundamental theological necessity for colonialism and the Industrial Revolution. So the use of other people and the use of land and water for whatever purpose we want, extraction capitalism and the kind of abuses that we've seen, that has to be premised, if you're going to justify this, on this theological ignoring of the value of these things. So I'm really grateful for the witness, really, of the theological tradition, but the witness of contemporary thinkers, some of them theologians, some of them people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is bringing indigenous thinking into conversation with science. And through her book and through all of us who are reading it, with theological reflection as well. And I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous peoples and their sense of interconnection and interrelationship. And ultimately, I think that is orthodox, but as I say, we've sort of neglected it. So it's this interesting moment of sort of wisdom convergence, where we're seeing theological reflection and the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples and science all coming together to remind us of our interdependence and to acknowledge the sort of overshoot, the damage that we've done, to be fair, in the name of making human life easier. And I'm not complaining. I actually really like air conditioning, so, not complaining. But we do have to acknowledge the truth of the unsustainability of our current way of life.
So one of the key justifications for this kind of human dominance really has to do with how do you translate those opening passages in Genesis?
Yeah.
We're given to be, and I want you to talk about this because the language, the words sovereignty and the word stewardship and so forth have an effect on how we understand what it is to be made in God's image. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the Genesis 1, I have a passage in the book that I don't know if I can recreate off the top of my head here, but it was really helpful to me to read Walter Brueggemann, who acknowledges in Genesis 1 we have this kind of presentation of human beings as special, as made in the image of God. And that's the section where we get this idea of dominion, which has, sort of curdled into domination since the Enlightenment. And as I say, that fundamentally we have to acknowledge that was really a theological reading that justified colonialism. So we have to acknowledge that. So we have that dominion in Genesis 1. And then in Genesis 2, you have this beautiful Genesis 2:15 that eco-theologians are always talking about, where human beings are made from the soil and given the vocation of serving and protecting the land. So we have dominion, and then we have serve and protect. And often what you'll see is this combination, this way of blending those two narratives to arrive at the word stewardship. Theodore Hebert is really good on this. He has a great article that explains this that I use with students too. So we wind up with stewardship. And that has actually been somewhat useful, the idea of stewardship. It implies responsibility. It implies a kind of duty to God, which is good, to bring God back into the equation here. But I think what we're discovering now is that it's too weak. Stewardship is too weak. So as you know, a group of us here at Calvin in 2019 spent the whole summer thinking about this. And we produced together a book called Beyond Stewardship, which I commend to church study groups. So a bunch of us from different disciplines got together and really asked the question, why isn't this wonderful idea of stewardship that we've been working on since the 1980s, why hasn't that sort of moved the needle for churches and really inspired church people to get involved with the climate movement and with creation care and all these wonderful things? So we sort of examined that word stewardship. And I think as I've reflected on that since, there's a number of problems with it. And one is it's still very anthropocentric. It implies that nothing happens unless we humans do it, which isn't really true scientifically. It also has this implication that if we're stewards, that means that we're here in God's absence. Like God is this distant landowner and we're kind of but God is not distant. God is present in creation. So the other problem I would say is that we're not in Genesis 1 and 2. We're not on a fresh new creation. We're on a damaged earth. So I really like the phrase partners in earth healing. And I want to focus on healing. Stewardship seems to suggest that things are fine, we just have to maintain. But that's not the case. So I like the idea of healing because it gives a little bit of a sense of the urgency of the situation. So much has been damaged. Species extinction. Chapter 4 in this book is on species extinction. That was, in a way, the hardest one to write. It's the chapter on lament. It's the chapter associated with Lent. Species extinction is terrifying. So, we are living on a damaged earth, and so our role is not just to maintain, we need to heal. And that's where we have to go back to that image of God idea and suggest that maybe the essential element of being made in the image of God right now is moral responsibility. None of the other creatures have this kind of capacity to decide. They work on instincts, and they have decision-making powers in their own ways, but we have this moral responsibility. And that's what I think we have to really activate now as part of our image of God creation status. So partners, I think, is really important too, because it doesn't center us as much as human beings. It acknowledges that we're partners with God in this work of healing the creation, and that we're partners with the creation itself. So to give agency back to this amazing, spectacular world that will take over, that will come back if given the chance. And that's, I think, also the power of the Refugia model, is it acknowledges the power of the natural world, its resilience. And our job is to partner with that knowledgeably and with this kind of moral responsibility. So it's not as easy a word as stewardship. It's kind of awkward, and you probably couldn't make it a domain name on a, on a website or something, but it has this sense of partnership with God and with the rest of creation. That I think that triangle is really important. And this idea of healing that gets us beyond our Genesis 1 vocation and acknowledges where we are now.
I like that because I've encountered among some Christians the attitude, the belief that God will provide and we don't need to worry about it because when we run out of oil here, we'll find oil there or a new way. And if this species is extinct, God will create a new species and so forth. And the idea of partnering, that's an invitation, that's a privilege.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, to be fair, pretty lousy theology. In chapter 6, in the Pentecost chapter, I examine this notion, it's really a metaphorical notion once again, of imagining God at the top of this pyramid. This is the Lutheran theologian Gail Ramshaw here. Yes. So the Lutherans are great.
Thank you.
They are on this, man.
My background is Lutheran, in case that's not evident.
I'm just, But Fortress Press is originally a Lutheran press, and they have been doing eco-theology for a long time. Anyway, chapter 6. So I'm thinking about the way we imagine God often as the top of this pyramid, and we're like the little serfs on the bottom. That's not really the post-resurrection vision of the church. The post-resurrection vision of the church is Christ at the center, and we are in the circle with Christ. And Christ calls us to be friends with God, partners with God, right? Our job is not merely to bow down and worship. Our job is to work with God as partners in this resurrection community. And the only way we can do that is through the Spirit. So that's why it's the Pentecost chapter, because otherwise we don't have the proper guidance to do this partnership work with God. So it seems to me this sense of passivity, which I completely acknowledge is so tempting, because the vocation of working with God is difficult, and it's costly, and it requires responsibility, and the world is overwhelming, and these problems are overwhelming. It is so tempting just to say, please, God, fix them. I think our call is to do both, is to say, please, God, fix them, and then get to work under the Spirit's guidance, and together, in this circle of the friends of Christ. So to just say, God is going to fix this, that to me is a relinquishing of our God-given responsibility. And inevitably, it's only, I'm not going to do anything because I'm benefiting from the status quo. Mm-hmm. So to say God is going to fix this is not as easy to do when your house has just been flooded by another hurricane, or when it's so dry you cannot feed your family because your crop. And this is what's happening in the world right now.
But not to me.
We are sheltered.
Caring for creation also means caring about human beings in places where we aren't.
Yes. And that I think is also one of the sort of fundamental principles of the climate movement, is that the people who have caused the most damage, intentionally or not, right? So the United States historically is by far the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. The people who have caused the most damage are not the people most and first affected. Right. It's the people who have caused the least damage who are the most, the immediately most vulnerable. They're the most immediately and the most severely affected. And we're seeing that all over the world right now. There's a reason why island countries have been pushing the UN to pressure the rich countries to help them, because they are the ones who are watching the ocean rise and watching their islands. Maldives, for example, they're going to be underwater. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of desperation, I think, among vulnerable people that those of us in the wealthy West are more protected from. So we are going to be seeing wildfires, floods, we already are, hurricanes. It will affect us. Climate change will affect us. It is affecting us. But we have so many resources that it doesn't feel yet as desperate as it does in other parts of the world.
Right. Do you think small steps are enough? Maybe this is inaccurate, but I'm thinking of a refugium as a place or a state of being in which I can take small steps. I can't fix everything, but I can do what I can. Under all the ash and debris to create safe spaces. Yeah, that question of scale is really crucial. And I'm glad you asked it. So I address that too at the end of the book. So Refugia by themselves is not going to do the job, right? If we are really going to address the climate crisis, it has to be a global effort, all hands on deck, government, business, individuals, the whole bit. So I would say the important thing is to do what we can to work on that large scale, to do our part on that large scale. But while that's happening, and I would hope that happens with a sense of speed and urgency, while that's happening, we still have to live on a local scale. Mm-hmm. And we still have to feel a sense of agency in order to keep going.
especially those of us who already have agency. We need to leverage that agency. So Refugia is a way to live on that local scale and to build communities of health. And I mean ecological health, but also spiritual and cultural health, which we are in desperate need of right now too, to build that on a small scale. And then Refugia only work if they grow and connect. So this is one of the things I'm learning from my biology colleagues. I was just talking with Tim Van Dielen and Rick Lindroth the other night on a Creation Justice Ministries event. And Tim is a mammal biologist, and he was pointing out that with mammal populations, Refugia work when there are corridors between them so that the populations can crossbreed, and that therefore the genetic diversity is maintained in the population and it continues to grow. So the important thing with these small scale things is to connect.
So they can't just be enclaves of...
Not for long.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe temporarily they have to be for whatever reasons are going on, but the whole point of them is to grow and connect.
So that is a very interesting metaphor for the church, even beyond ecological considerations, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think one of the important things for us to think about as people in the church and Refugia is connecting with other churches, yes, but not just other churches. That we really have to be connecting across faiths and across communities, and seeing that as our role to hold these beautiful, healthy spaces, which, there's work to do to create beautiful, healthy spaces in our churches, but to share that with others, and not just other churches, but people of other faiths. And that kind of, if we want to think about it as biodiversity, right? That biodiversity is strength. Biodiversity is resilience in nature. And I think we have to think about it that way too in the church, that diversity is strength.
Very interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears and ask how you have you always been a nature lover?
No and yes.
Okay.
So I think I have been a nature lover in ways I didn't understand until recently, which is interesting. So as a kid, I was always a bookish child. Probably all of us in the English department were very bookish children. Read like crazy, and also music. As you know, we do music together. And so I think I have been mostly invested in books and the arts for most of my life. On the other hand, I have always been connected to place. I've always been connected to Michigan. We had these weedy fields around my house when I was growing up. I was just weirdly fascinated with these weedy fields. I mean, they were not beautiful by objective standards maybe, but I just loved them. And I've always loved the lakeshore of Michigan. I've lived other places in my life and missed Michigan terribly and been embarrassed about that, because I thought I must be so parochial. I can't bear New
Clearly,
Jersey or Iowa. Clearly,
you just hadn't seen Ohio.
Yeah. Right? And now I've come to realize actually connection to place is how we're meant to be. So this is what we're learning from Indigenous people, again, those of us who've been sort of clueless, is that human beings are designed to be connected to place.
You mentioned in your book Willie James Jennings' work on that too, that race and ethnicity were originally connected to place, not to body.
Yes, right. So these Indigenous peoples who conceived of themselves only in connection with this land and waters that they knew and were interacting with, were interdependent with. And so Willie James Jennings, the Yale Div School theologian, also a Calvin grad, has done this beautiful work describing the beginnings of colonialism in the Americas, and how the very first premise of colonialism was to divide the identity of people from land. And that winds up positing race in skin, in the body. It's a fascinating and I think utterly convincing premise, and he shows it, with receipts from his historical study. So to be connected to place is actually how we're meant to be as human beings, and I think you could argue that from Genesis again. We are, as human beings, often migrating and exiled across history, but connection to place is the stability, So all that to say, I think I have always had that connection, and it's been latent. And it's been such a joy in these last few years to connect with our science colleagues and connect with nature writers and just indulge that connection to place and really dwell into it.
And you really have dug in. You spent sabbatical time taking a geography course and studying dunes. And
So one of the things I always say my favorite place in this book is the acknowledgments pages. Because it's such a Calvin book. It is so embedded in Calvin's work and with my colleagues. So I mentioned this Beyond Stewardship project. The work on the book was supported by a sabbatical grant and a CCCS grant, which helped me with hiring a research assistant to do the footnotes, because no one enjoys footnotes, but but that work had to be done. It's important. And I spent a lot of time connecting with science colleagues and asking them questions. As you mentioned, I spent a whole semester. This was actually not during sabbatical. I was teaching 3 classes and taking Deanna's course. But we have wonderful science colleagues, and they're so generous and so excited to teach what they know to other people, even English professors. So I have really, really depended on this whole university community to learn more. And what a privilege to be part of a community where I can get a notion like this and then really indulge it. And the Festival of Faith and Writing has been a big part of this. It was really the inspiration. So I got into this originally when we invited Bill McKibben and some other nature writers, including Kathleen Dean Moore. And reading Bill McKibben's books was really the tipping point for me, where I just decided this is something I need to work on now. This is important. This is a big, big deal. The climate crisis is what I'm referring to here, the climate crisis is a big, big deal. And those of us who have any kind of capacity need to be working on this. So then the Beyond Stewardship group, that's when I really started reading eco-theology and realizing, okay, I really do love theology. And I felt like this whole eco-theological space was a kind of missing piece in my theological training. And so we've talked about creation theology here at Calvin, but it's always kind of this simple, God creates the world, oops, the world has fallen, God's redeeming the world. That's kind of as far as it goes. Eco-theology goes way deep into that, and that has been a really wonderful missing piece, and it's just been exciting to know that there's a whole history of theological reflection on this that I've sort of missed, and so now I'm just indulging in that.
Yeah, it goes way back. There is a lot more than I had realized. We're sitting here in the Bunker Nature Center on Calvin's campus, and the rain has stopped. It was going to be a very soggy, beautiful backdrop, but nice. But lots of activity here in terms of understanding creation care.
Yeah.
Can you talk more broadly about places and organizations where you see real models for positive change in the world?
Yeah, well, for people who want to get more involved, there are many wonderful Christian groups. So the Evangelical Environmental Network is doing great work. They do advocacy work. They're really good communicators. Our graduate, Kyle Myerd-Scott, is the vice president now. And Kyle really knows how to talk to an evangelical audience. And those folks are doing wonderful work. Creation Justice Ministries comes out of Washington, D.C., and they provide a lot of great resources for churches. Let's see, who else? There's any number of great podcasts. And actually, if viewers wanted to go to my website, there's a whole list of resources, suggested resources on my website. Books, organizations, podcasts, apps on your phone to identify birdies.
Those are in the book too.
Some are in the book. There's a more extensive list on my website. And on my website also you can sign up for my newsletter. My newsletter comes out every 2 weeks, and it's my attempt as a non-expert to do the research and understand climate news for the previous 2 weeks. And then think about it from the perspective of churches and faith. So there are lots of ways, as I say, to get involved. And I would say for Christian Reformed churches, if they happen to be Christian Reformed churches, the Climate Witness Project is a great first place to get involved. And that's out of the Office of Social Justice at the Christian Reformed Church. And they do great work. They provide resources and programming and So yeah, lots of ways to get involved.
Good. Had we more time, I might want to talk more broadly about the metaphorical refugium that the church can be, but I really do. I appreciate the way you've tied together faith, ecology, and all the reading you've done, all the work you've done. Under the ashes, there are exciting things happening, and so I appreciate the book. I recommend it highly. It'll make you fall in love with nature, except for buckthorn.
Yes.
We have to talk about buckthorn. I'm nervous about that.
It's totally depraved.
Yes, right, yeah. Not all nature is good nature, apparently. So.
Well, it's all in its
We have
place,
the same issues
right?
with mosquitoes. Right?
Right.
They must have a function, but it's hard to know what it is. But thank you so much for your time, Deborah, and thank you all for watching. And we'll see you in January.